This is a memorial for Fidel to talk about him and how he's impacted Cuba and the world. This is an opportunity to hear about Fidel from people who are knowledgeable about Cuba and its reality. I think of Fidel as one of the most extraordinary human beings that lived during my lifetime. And I think he had enduring ideas, and his words, his teachings, his legacy, I think, will last for a long time. And so we're going to tonight have a chance to hear about him, and both from people who've had some direct experience and some people who are knowledgeable. So I don't know if any of you noticed, but the U.S. media has had a rather one-sided view of Fidel, and we're hoping to bring you some other views and to talk about Cuba's accomplishments. When you came in, there's written copies of the speech given by Cuban President Raul Castro at the tribute to Fidel in Santiago de Cuba, and you're welcome to take a copy. It's a really interesting and great speech about Fidel and Cuba. This program is sponsored by the Minnesota Cuba Committee. We were formed to support the sovereignty of Cuba and also to educate the public about Cuba's reality. We'll be sponsoring our 8th annual Cuban Film Festival in February, and I hope all of you attend. It's a great event that lasts for several weeks and shows some of the major films coming out of Cuba. We meet every 2 weeks on Sunday evenings at 6 p.m. at Bone Shaker Books. Everyone here is welcome to come. Cards with our email and website are on the table back there too, and you can get information on our website about the next meeting. So just a few notes about this, about the evening. John Terrazas, who's back there, is going to be doing Spanish translation for anybody who needs it. This slideshow that you're seeing up here, and we'll continue running it through so you get a chance to see all the photos, was created by Carla Reilly, one of our Cuban committee members, and she didn't take the pictures, but she put together the slideshow. So great job, and I want to thank MJ here for organizing all the great food that's back there. We have a really big agenda, and we absolutely have to be out of the church by 9. So we have to keep careful track of time, and we have to keep moving. So before we get going, I just wanted you to notice that back there, a student of August Nims is videotaping this event to be shown on Northwest Community Television and some other community television shows. And is there anybody in the room who objects to having their photo, their being filmed in this? Just raise your hand. There's no problem. She can just not take your photo. So if anybody objects, just raise your hand.
Is that without the name?
What?
Was that without the name? I don't mind my photo. I don't know what my name was.
Oh, nobody's name is going to be on it. No, it's just a photo of the event and what's happening. Okay, so we'll try to leave some time at the end for discussion, questions and answers, and for your thoughts about Fidel. We're going to pass around these baskets. I'll pass them around after I'm done talking, which are for donations for the event in the Cuba Committee. It's kind of, we're doing it, pushing it in your face that you make a donation, so I will be passing these around, and then you can make a donation, or we have a donation basket on the food table. So I want to start by introducing August Nims, who will be, he's the co-chair of the Minnesota Cuba Committee, and he's a professor professor at the University of Minnesota and teaches classes about Cuba, and he's going to provide a framework for us on discussing Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution.
Thanks,
I think you have to turn it on, it's probably.
It's on. It's on.
Is it? Oh, good, okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. On behalf of the Minnesota Cuba Committee, I really want to thank everyone for coming out on this cold evening to celebrate with warm enthusiasm the life of Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. 2 years and 2 days ago, a momentous development took place that many of us in this room thought unlikely. Presidents Raul Castro and Barack Obama's announcement that both of their governments would begin the process to restore diplomatic relations and the normalization of other relations. In case you might have concluded from that announcement and the discussions between both governments since then, that the ruling class in the United States had now finally come to its senses and has finally come to accept the existence of the Cuban Revolution, you're probably having second thoughts. The coverage of Fidel Castro's death by the big business media has likely been a rude awakening for you. From the conservative to the liberal end of the continuum of the media, you have been offered a sobering lesson in capitalism's unrelenting hostility to the Cuban Revolution. Exactly because Fidel epitomized the very essence of the revolution is why the coverage of his death was so hostile. What animates that hostility? How to explain? First and foremost, it has to do with what took place on the island more than a half a century ago. One of those rare moments in human history when the subjects or the subjugated in society become the protagonists. To fully appreciate what happened, it is necessary, I think, to think historically, big history. Not long after the birth of the modern working class, yes, that class who the pundits have just discovered, sought to take political power in order to improve its life chances. The first insurrection it staged in 1848 went down to a bloody defeat in Paris. It tried again in 1871, also in Paris. And for the first time ever, workers were able to actually take power, but were only able to hold power for 2.5 months. It was too drowned in blood. It would take almost a half century before the working class, this time in alliance with the peasantry, would again be successful. This time in Russia in This time in Russia in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution. But by at least a decade later, it was increasingly clear that a counter-revolution was underway in the Soviet Union. And by then, a bureaucratic social era headed by Stalin had usurped political power, the product of another bloody overturn. To understand what happens in a counter-revolution, think the Arab Spring in Egypt and how it was hijacked. The history of the insurrectionary working class teaches, therefore, that it is one thing to take power, it's another to actually hold it. And never has the working class been in power as long as it's been in Cuba, more than half a century. And how is that possible? The Cuban Revolution teaches that a real revolution can't be brought into existence by elections. It teaches that even mass demonstrations are not sufficient. A real revolution involves the actual taking of power by the masses themselves. Once the rebel army of about 3,000 combatants had broken the back of the Batista army after 2 years of fighting, the Cuban masses, in the tens and hundreds of thousands, became the architects of history, beginning with the general strike on January 1st, 1959. Nothing made it clearer that this wasn't just a general strike when the masses, in coordination with the rebel army and the underground movement, took over virtually all of the police stations on the island. For Black Lives Matter activists, if you want to know how to really end police brutality, that's what we will have to do here. And then the peasantry went into motion. Spontaneous expropriation of the land of the landlords, both domestic and international owners. The new revolutionary government began to organize and institutionalize those expropriations with the Agrarian Reform Law of May 1959. As Raul Castro put it, that law did more than anything until then to convince Washington why the Cuban Revolution had to be overthrown. And then in 1960, the working classes went into motion. When capitalist bosses fled to Miami, workers carried out what was called interventions, realizing that they had to take over the factories in order to keep them running. This was the beginning of the nationalization of the means of production, the beginning of the socialist phase of the revolution. Again, revolutions can't be voted into power. All elections do is to register preferences for either candidates or policies. Power has to be taken, exactly what the toilers of Cuba began doing on January 1st, 1959. And unlike anywhere else since the Bolshevik Revolution, the toilers had a government that supported and helped organize the taking of power. Using that governmental power to arm the masses, to secure the conquest, their conquest was indispensable. That's what made it possible to defeat Washington's mercenary invasion of the island in April 1961. The mercenaries met an armed people who were willing to die to defend their new conquests. That's the fundamental reason why the mercenaries were defeated at the Bay of Pigs, or Playa Girón, only 72 hours after their invasion. The first defeat U.S. imperialism had ever suffered, and thus another reason for Washington's implacable hatred for the revolution. And in the midst of that victory, the socialist course of the revolution was proclaimed. The bourgeois forces in the government had long fled to Miami. In that proclamation, Fidel explained that because the first socialist revolution in the Americas was made 90 miles from the shores of U.S. imperialism, right under their noses, as Fidel put it, they will never forgive us. The Cuban Revolution was Washington's Don Corleone problem. Washington, in other words, got disrespected in its own backyard. If the Cuban toilers could get away with it, other toilers in the hemisphere could be inspired to do the same. Cuba, in other words, was a bad example for Washington. That's the essential reason for the hatred of the Cuban Revolution that was so uniformly on display in the capitalist media's coverage of Fidel's death. It remains a bad example. But it's not enough, as history has shown, for workers to take power. It has to be kept. And that means the toilers will have to actually run the new society. That's what made the literacy campaign in 1961 also important. Bringing up all of Cuba's workers and peasants to at least an elementary grade reading and writing level was necessary. And that was what was achieved in that defining moment of the revolution. That was the same year in which the mercenary expedition at the Bay of Pigs was defeated. Most crucial in the literacy campaign was how both the teachers, largely young women, and their students, largely peasants, would transform themselves in the process. Yes, learning to read and write is of enormous importance, but doing that through voluntary labor was transformative for both teachers as well as students. In the patriarchal world of that era, the tens of thousands of young women were forever marked by that experience. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to see and share with others Catherine Murphy's wonderful documentary about the literacy campaign, Maestra. The literacy campaign, I contend, was a decisive moment in understanding why the Cuban Revolution was able to survive in the face of Washington's 5-decade-long unrelenting hostility. The entire process in those first 3 years of the revolution revealed two indispensable requirements for making a revolution: the conquest of state power and the kind of leadership that Fidel provided. Without a Fidel in this most crucial stage of the revolution, its survival, I am convinced, would not have been possible. The Arab Spring illustrates tragically what happens when a revolutionary movement lacks the kind of leadership Fidel provided. Some of the more savvy voices of the media, capitalist media, did mention, almost in passing, some of the social gains of the revolution, such as Cuba's internationally well-known healthcare and education system. But what that media went out of its way to not report is Cuba's decade-long and proud record of proletarian internationalism. Nelson Mandela captured it best when he visited Cuba not long after coming out of prison in 1990, when he told a mass rally in Matanzas, Cuba, that, quote, were it not for what you did in Angola in 1988, I would not be able to be here today with you. He also said, quote, what other country can point to a record of greater selflessness than Cuba has displayed in its relations with Africa, unquote. When the last continuous returned from Angola in 1991, Raul was most prophetic. In a speech, he said that what the Cuban volunteers had done in Angola helped to save the Cuban Revolution. The selflessness that Cubans displayed in Angola made it possible for the revolution to survive its greatest crisis, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, and what the Cubans called the Special Period. Perhaps the most noble and self-sacrificing moment of the revolution's proletarian internationalism is what it did in West Africa in the summer and fall of 2014, when 256 volunteers, at the request of the World Health Organization, went to fight the Ebola epidemic. They were selected out of 12,000 Cubans who had volunteered to go. No other government in the world made such a contribution to fighting the scourge. Again, what state power makes possible. All of us in this room owe a debt to the Cuban Revolution, whether we are aware of it or not. Unless scourges like Ebola are controlled at the source, we are all unsafe. In a world in which a pestilence is only an airplane flight away, to think that controlling the borders of the United States or any country against Ebola that is effective is naive at best. If the Obama project were to be successful, the bringing of capitalism back to Cuba, and that's what it's really about, the values of proletarian internationalism, sharing one's limited resources with the most oppressed in the world, would be undermined. Capitalism would begin to erode such values. Capitalism is about what its ideological defenders sometimes call self-interest, or what the rest of us call selfishness. Or I got mine and you get yours, what have you done for me lately thinking. The enmity for the Cuban example is especially rabid at this moment, and not just because of the new administration that's about to take office. The Trump election rather registers a deeper problem for capitalism, its increasing inability to ensure prosperity for working people. That's what his election registers. What's deplorable is not that some of our fellow workers may have voted for Trump in the belief that the demagogue would provide jobs. As Marx once said, a drowning person will grab hold to a twig for salvation. Many an African-American worker voted for Obama thinking that their lives would improve and have since learned otherwise. Just ask the citizens of Flint, Michigan. No, what's deplorable is an economical political system in which workers think that the only way in which they can have a job, put food on the table for their families, or pay a mortgage note is to vote for a racist, sexist, misogynist, xenophobic candidate. That's what's deplorable and truly irredeemable. It was capitalism that gave us Trump, and why would anyone want to see capitalism back in Cuba? That's a discussion we should have. Until the very end, Fidel gave political instructions how to bury a hero of the working class revolution. For those of us who have long wished that Lenin's corpse be removed from the tomb that Stalin constructed to turn Lenin against his wishes into a mummified icon, Fidel has now set a standard. As Raul revealed in Santiago, his last wish was that, quote, after his death, his name and likeness never be used to designate institutions, plazas, parks, avenues, streets, or any other public spaces, nor monuments, busts, statues, and other such tributes be erected. In accordance with Compañero Fidel's decision, Raul went on to say, during the next period of sessions of the National Assembly of People's Power, we will present necessary legislative proposals to ensure his will is upheld, unquote. In other words, Fidel to the end wanted no Stalinist cult of personality. To have lived in the era of Fidel as Marcy mentioned, to have lived in the era of Fidel is a privilege. Fidel is irreplaceable because at certain and rare moments in history, such individuals appear. And all of us, all of the working class humanity, we've been privileged to have been in the same world he was in. I suspect the only thing Fidel would not have agreed with is the postponement until next month of Bastion 2016. As some of you know, every December the 2nd, the day the Granma landed in 1956, the entire population of the island mobilizes for military preparedness. It also sends a message to the unforgiving enemy 90 miles away that Cubans, we are not lowering our guard. We are prepared to defend our revolution by any means necessary. Fidel, I think, would have said, quote, my funeral can be postponed. Most important is letting our enemy know that preparing to defend ourselves is necessary, cannot be postponed. But that's my humble opinion. I raise this to stress that the Cuban Revolution has survived because the Cuban masses are prepared to defend it. Without that readiness, there's no way the revolution could have survived 90 miles from the shores of the most powerful state in history that unceasingly seeks its overthrow. No word was uttered more in the capitalist media's coverage of Fidel's death than, quote, dictator. Yes, there is a dictatorship in Cuba, but it's not of an individual or a couple of brothers in their 80s, but rather a dictatorship of the Cuban working class that took power 5 decades ago and continues to keep power by imposing its will. That was the real target of the media's hostility, and I think we should defend the right of the Cuban masses to take whatever measures they deem necessary to defend their revolution against Washington's unrelenting aggression, including in the new, quote, Obama's Let's Play Nice, quote, rendition. Please read, if you haven't, Raul's speech that he gave on December the 3rd in Santiago, where Fidel's remains were interred. It's very educational. And after recounting key moments in Fidel's life, Raul said, quote, this is the undefeated Fidel who brings us together through his example and demonstration that yes, we could, yes, we can, and yes, we will. I repeat, he demonstrated that yes, we could, yes, we can, and yes, we will overcome any obstacle, threat, or turmoil in our determined efforts to build socialism in Cuba. Or to say it another way, Raul went on to say, which is the same thing, quote, to guarantee the independence and sovereignty of our homeland, unquote. The spirit of the speech underlines, I think, that Fidel's death is an important turning point for the revolution. The exact opposite of what the enemies of the revolution had hoped for. The 9 days in Cuba marked a strengthening and deepening of the commitment of Cubans of all ages throughout the island to defend their revolution. A student in my Cuban Revolution class, who's in close contact with her family in Cuba, confirmed this assessment. Also in his speech, Raul said, echoing the president of Algeria, that one of Fidel's great assets was his ability to see into the future. Raul mentioned specifically Fidel seeing in 1989 the possible collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. And if that should happen, he said, Cuba was prepared to maintain the banner of socialist revolution. Exactly what happened. Another foresight of Fidel was what he said when the Cuban Five were arrested in 1998. Volverán, they will return. Exactly what happened when the last of them returned on December the 17th, 2014. I confess that not all of us were as confident that would happen. Not only did Fidel live long enough to see that victory, but also a long-time defender of the Cuban Revolution and member of our Cuba Committee who led our work to defend the Five, free the Five, Frank Forrestal, who died almost a year later. Fidel made another prediction that Raul could have mentioned, a claim that all of us should seriously ponder, especially in the moment in which we find ourselves. In a speech in the context of increasing U.S. hostility toward the revolution, a few weeks before the Bay of Pigs, the first defeat for U.S. imperialism, Fidel said, quote, there will be a victorious socialist revolution in the United States before a victorious counter-revolution in Cuba. I'll repeat. There will be a victorious socialist revolution in the United States before a victorious counter-revolution in Cuba, unquote. On January 1st, this coming January 1st, the working class will have been in power for 58 years, at least 4 times longer than the working class in the Soviet Union. Despite the plans of the Obama administration and no doubt his successor, there has been no victorious counter-revolution. We therefore still have time to prove Fidel correct. Fidel's revolutionary optimism, his unwavering confidence in the working class, what his words captured and what his enemies hate, is the real Fidel. For those of us still trying to absorb the significance of Trump's election and who may have fallen into a bit of pessimism, never forget that moment after the Granma landing at the end of 1956, when 82 fighters who were on the yacht, the Granma yacht, were shipwrecked. And the vast majority of those 82 had been killed or captured by Batista's army. Never forget Fidel's reaction when after a couple of weeks, 12 of them, only 12 of the 82, were able to regroup after wandering in the forests of the Sierra Maestra. 12 of them and 7 rifles. And Fidel's memorial words, quote, "Now we will win the war," unquote. When Raul recounted that moment at the mass rally in Santiago on December the 3rd, the crowd erupted with shouts of, "Fidel, Fidel, that's Fidel." That's the Fidel we celebrate tonight. That's the Fidel who should inspire us to realize what he predicted. Again, there will be a victorious socialist revolution in the United States before a victorious counter-revolution in Cuba.
Thank you, August, our esteemed professor. We are very fortunate tonight to have quite an esteemed panel to share their perspectives on Cuba. And we're asking tonight that each of them speak at around 7 minutes or less so that we have enough time for everyone to ask questions and enough time for everyone to speak. But before we begin, I want to ask, is Gloria Echevarria here? No? Okay, we were hoping that she would be here. She returned from Cuba and her father and Fidel were very good friends. And so we were hoping that she would be here and could share some of her memories. So with that, we will start with, see, I told you, see, I'm a stand-in, so I gotta figure out where I'm, okay, now I've got it. We have Professor Joseph Mbele from the College of St. Olaf College, who brings a perspective of the African countries toward Fidel and Cuba. So, Professor, it is yours.
Thank you very much. I wish I could speak for 10 hours.
7 minutes.
I'll stay.
Yeah. So what do I do in 7 minutes? But thank you. Thank you very much for including me in the panel. When Professor Nims sent the email inviting me, I just screamed and said, of course I'll be there. I am from Tanzania, and I think it's very appropriate that somebody speak for Africa. It's very appropriate. We hear all these voices about Castro, all these voices about Cuba. I have been in this country for many years. I have taught at St. Olaf College in Northfield for 25 years. I came in 1991, and hearing all the stories, mainstream America tells about Cuba, I was not happy. And before then, I had studied at the University of Wisconsin, Madison, from 80 to 86, same thing. So it's very important that people hear the African voices as well. African voices do matter in this issue as in any other issue. My country in Eastern Africa, we became independent in 1961, and immediately under our first president, Julius Nyerere, we decided to be on the front line of supporting liberation movements all over Southern Africa, all over Africa. And that's how we connected with Cuba, right there. That's how we connected with the Eastern European countries, the Soviet Union and other places, because we were pursuing the same goals: to fight, colonialism, to fight imperialism. Naturally, we became allies. And so Cuba, with our country, with the countries in Southern Africa, we became very connected because we had common objectives. I want to say this. Cuba, over the years, did send troops to Southern Africa. You know that. Thousands of soldiers. 1974, 1988, thousands. But the propaganda in this country was suggesting, or rather claiming, that Castro is intervening in Africa, as if Castro was imposing himself in Africa. That's the kind of thing that made me very, very uncomfortable. Our countries in Southern Africa, including my country, we called ourselves the frontline state. We invited Cuba. You can quote me on that. It was our decision to invite Cuba. And because of the solidarity, internationalism, as Professor Nims mentioned, Cuba regularly came. We were fighting apartheid, and the apartheid army was threatening Angola. The apartheid army was threatening all of us. There was so much sabotage going on. And the military occupation of Namibia and attempt to, attack Angola. Those are crucial moments. And Cuba came, and as you know, the rest is history. South Africa was defeated. But I do want to stress this. The propaganda is completely, unacceptable. Cuba never imposed itself anywhere in Africa. A few days ago, when Castro passed away, you could witness the reactions from all over Africa. Our leaders, whether it was from Nigeria, from Congo, from Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Angola, Namibia, you name it, they continued to salute Cuba, Castro. We mourned the passing of Castro. The president of Congo, for example, he attended the funeral. He attended the funeral in Cuba, and in his speech he said, after this event, after this commemoration, we are going to have our own commemoration in Congo. He made that kind of announcement. If you go online and look, you'll find a lot of photographs of Castro with a lot of the African leaders. We were great friends. You can find photographs of Castro with the late Amilcar Cabral, the leader of Cape Verde. When we were in the West, Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, you can find photographs of him and the late Agostinho Neto of Angola, the leaders of Namibia, not to mention Mandela and the other South African leaders, the leader of my country, Julius Nyerere, and so on and so on and so on and so on. There was tremendous friendship between Cuba, Castro, and the Africans. We were great friends. To conclude, because I have only 7 minutes, I don't even know if I don't know if I have any remaining seconds. Growing up in Tanzania, we grew up with these things. It's not theoretical. That is my experience. I was an undergraduate student at the University of Dar es Salaam. Tanzania hosted freedom fighters from all these countries. Tanzania was in the front line. We interacted with all these exiles. A lot of these leaders of the freedom movement in Southern Africa would come to the university to talk to us. So, and they would talk about Cuba. They would talk about Castro. They would talk about the solidarity, the support they were getting from Castro, military, economic, diplomatic, political. We witnessed how Castro trained a lot of Africans. There are so many African students, including students I know, Tanzanians I know, who were trained in Cuba. As an undergraduate, we used to read a lot about liberation movements, theories of revolution from all over the world. And I remember writings of Fidel Castro were very central for us. His speech, "History Will Absorb Me," we loved it. That's the speech he gave at his trial, 1953, 54. Yeah, "History will absorb me." We loved that speech. It is so profound, you know, the way it captures a lot of the issues that, you know, mattered to the revolution in Cuba and to the revolution around the world. Cuba built schools in my country. When I was an undergraduate and about to finish, I was supposed to teach in one of those schools, a high school. It's in a place called Kilosa. I was supposed, after my graduation, to go to Cuba to study a little bit about the Cuban educational system. What happened was I was recruited by the University of Dar es Salaam instead. Otherwise, I would have studied in Cuba. Those schools are there. Cuba helped us in so many other ways, you know, with doctors, technology, you know, in terms of sugar, production of sugar. Cuba is, you know, a leader in this field. But there's so much that continues our relationship with Cuba. So basically, I wanted to come to show myself like this, and I know there will be questions. I would love to answer questions, and I do want to say the African perspective matters. We are not about to silence other people's perspectives, but our own perspective has been silenced too long, and it's time the world heard our perspective.
Thank you, Professor. Not only do you know how to do 7 minutes, but you know how to make it very clear for us to understand, so we will quote you.
So, our next speaker is Natalie. She wants to Alonge. And Natalie is a former student at ELAM, which is the Latin American School of Medicine in Cuba, and she's currently with the Christ Rose Revolution Fund, which works in Cuba.
Oh, yeah, you can do that, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Marcy. Thank you, everyone, for coming out. Is it okay? Okay. Great. So, yes, it is hard to decide where to begin and, put the significance of Cuba and what it's done for our lives and our family. It's hard to express, but Fidel created ELAM in 1999. It's the largest medical school in the world, and it gives scholarships to over 20,000 students, representative of 190 plus countries. We have a sister school in Venezuela, and that's where the majority of the Latin American students are. Since the creation of ELAM, U.S. Students have been granted scholarships, and so I think that's a wonderful fact of Fidel, and despite our government's policies towards the country, students such as myself are granted full scholarships, which include housing, tuition, this uniform, 3 meals a day, and a stipend. We get paid to study in Cuba. It's $4 a month, but that goes a long way. It's a little bit contrast in our country. I am $45,000 in debt thanks to my private undergraduate education. So medical school in the U.S. was not appealing whatsoever. I found out about Cuba and its theories and activism while protesting at the School of Americas with our friend Marty here. And as I learned more, I was just attracted to these ideas of equality, of human rights, of free healthcare, education for all. Everybody is walking around Cuba with a 4-year university degree, so you're having intellectual conversations with anybody on the street. And so when John and I, John is over here in the back, he is Papa, we had the opportunity presented itself to move to Cuba. We said yes, and he's studying international relations there, so we couldn't imagine a more perfect place to study those topics than Cuba. Fidel has been a great father for the country, for the Cubans who enjoy, many things such as the free university, and also, the literacy rate, and also there's no hunger, there's no homelessness, there's no orphanages, there's no cursing or swearing in the streets, there's no violence, really. There's no guns, except for the police, which never use them. You just don't hear about things. We hear these stories. We were in Cuba, and they said, "Oh, did you hear about the shooting in the U.S.?" And we're looking at each other like, "Which one?" So it's a safe place for many people to learn. A lot of people. It's an international place. Everybody else is there except for the U.S. There's people from Venezuela, everywhere. It's a normal international large city, Havana, that is. And so the students that are there right now are primarily from Africa. We have 2,000 from South Africa, 2,000 from Angola, a strong group from Congo, and we also have 2,000 from Brazil, some Latin Americans, but also, and Pacific Islanders. But what struck me the most was that, so we have a lot of students from Palestine and from Syria. And it was difficult for me to imagine sitting in the classroom with people, we come from the U.S., okay, we have peace of mind with our families back home, but I thought, oh my gosh, how can they possibly be studying when you're just worrying about your families back home? And the truth is that most of them had either grown up or were coming from refugee situations. And so what Fidel is doing is not just educating people to go back, to their countries and be doctors. That's great. But it's also giving these young people opportunities, and these not developing countries, but these places where there's different things going on, and who can object to more doctors? In such political times where, maybe a 2-state solution, 1-state solution, this and that, just humanity, everybody can agree on. And so we thank Fidel for ELAM and for providing, those 3 meals a day. We don't have to work for them, and that's more than what, a lot of people are not guaranteed those 3 meals a day. So we're very grateful for that. And so we take a great responsibility, I feel, as U.S. citizens. People are traveling all across the world and killing each other left and right to reach this country, and all we had to do to become citizens was just be born. And so John and I feel that we should share our experience in Cuba and all that it has to offer. And so we founded Christ Rose Revolution Fund, a nonprofit, so that we can support. We believe this system should be supported, and in an autonomous way, where foreigners are coming. I always say you can travel to Jamaica and have a great time, but that's not really the reality of how Jamaicans are living. So a lot of the tourism that's happening in Cuba now, we just want people to be aware of what's going on and the reality of the experiences there. So we partner with different local churches and groups and government officials, to get these dialogues, going and see how can we be a part of the future. So we are welcome to questions at the end. I hope to meet some of you. And we don't have enough great things to say about Cuba. We've experienced it all. The pluses and the minuses, we are helped up on the bus, and you see people hugging and loving each other, and their neighbors care about you. And we've had to think for ourselves what to do without internet. We're learning medicine in books, God forbid. So we've experienced dengue, and we've had to bring up our buckets of water up, second-story buildings, and so we just pray that all of the work that Cuba Solidarity activists are doing is supported and loved, and we have great conversations with people that disagree with us in this country, and hopefully maybe some socialist ideas can be sprinkled around each other, but the point is that Cuba has been just a great learning ground on how to love each other, to educate each other. We don't have to look behind our backs, when we're walking in the street at night, or be given weird looks as a biracial couple, we just can be free and accepted there. And so that's a little bit about our life. Thank you so much.
Thank you. There we go. I'll learn how to do this a little quicker as we go along. Thank you, Natalie. I'm sure there are going to be several questions for you at the end of the program. And now we have Mr. Mel Reeves, who's a known activist and journalist here in Minneapolis. And so, without further ado, Mr. Reeves.
Good evening. Good evening. When I was asked to be on the panel, I kept thinking when I saw that August was going to be a keynote speaker, I thought, okay, what can I add? But then I realized that the thinking was probably to have someone who can kind of give a perspective from an African American, and also most of y'all don't know that I'm actually, so now you'll know that there's something wrong with me. I'm actually from Miami. Yeah. So I'm really going to acknowledge it now, that I'd be here in this cold. But otherwise, I would have a chance to see you all's happy faces, and I've met great people I have. But yeah, I'm from Miami. I grew up in Miami, so I have a real different perspective of the Cuban Revolution, because I kind of grew up with it, and yeah, that's how old I am. And so Fidel's death is like, so I've lost two of my heroes in this year, Muhammad Ali and Fidel Castro. And yeah, you can clap for that, brother. And they're similar, because they were both resolute. Near the end of Ali's life, there's some people influencing his life that caused him to make some different choices, but he had clearly stood up to U.S. imperialism. And that's what I really respect about Fidel Castro, because he was resolute to his death. When I was growing up, with the slings and arrows being thrown at Cuba and Fidel, there was no way that you would think he would get to 90 and die peacefully in his sleep. You can take bets on that one, against that idea. And that's because folks in this room probably know this, but I'm going to go over some things you should know. That is, that there were dozens of attempts on Fidel's life, right? There were dozens, literally dozens of attempt by the CIA against on the life of Fidel Castro. And so you have to ask, so, you know, especially, somebody mentioned this earlier, you know, why is the big business press, mass media, presenting such a one-sided picture of Fidel? And it's because, you know, despite their objections and their cries of being objective, you know, the big business press media is not objective, right? Most people we should know that by now if you didn't know it. They take a side. And when you talk to a reporter, they'll argue with you. No, I'm objective. It's like, no. Your boss has a perspective, and he's trying to maintain U.S. imperialism. That's their perspective. They're big business. That's their job. At the end of the day, they may give us a little juice every once in a while. They're fair on occasion, but at the end of the day, they're going to report the news from the perspective of their masters. And so, therefore, they're not going to reveal to us who Fidel Castro really was. One of the best features I saw by a bourgeois press, actually was The Guardian over in England, in the UK, did a fair, actually, portrait of Fidel. They actually showed the funeral procession. They interviewed the people on the street. If you get a chance to see it, I tried to put it up on Facebook, I think. I'm not sure if I did or not. But they actually interviewed people on the street, just walked up, and there were some great statements by people on the street. And you could see the love and admiration that the Cuban people have for Fidel. And it's too bad that a lot of people just won't get a chance to see that, even those who are opposed to Fidel. And Fidel's death also kind of reveals, I think, how far away, I think, in this country that we are from real change. You know, the beauty of growing up in Miami was that, you know, the Fidel Castro was a revolutionary. Whatever you knew about Fidel, he was a revolutionary. You found out that the island was about 60 to 70% black, right? And when you found that out, it was interesting because we didn't know that right away, because the folks coming over from Cuba weren't telling us that. And most of the people who were coming over from Cuba, especially initially, were white Cubans, for lack of a better designation. They were white. And so they would tell us all these stories about Fidel, right? And then when we found out that the island was black, if you weren't political, you started thinking, so they're running away from a black island. Oh, we get it. You know, black people are enjoying rights over there. You're equal to black people. Oh, so we started to, they used to come in our community and cry on our shoulders about how they were persecuted. But once we really started to figure things out, and once the white Cubans started acting like white people, yeah, that's right. They got over here and started acting like the other folks who claim white supremacy. You know the story. They began to, when they first came over, we were neighbors. We cooperated. I could borrow a cup of sugar, or a slice of butter from you. When they moved up a little bit, they didn't know anybody anymore. And that's how they played it out. The Cubans depended on the African Americans to kind of figure their way around Miami, because I think the white population kind of ignored them and treated them as immigrants. And they were embraced initially by the black population. But once they began to move up, so to speak, they began to turn around and discriminate against the black population. So I'm raising that because when people come to you and they have an axe to grind, what you're going to pay attention to is their character at some point, right? They say, oh, we were oppressed here, right? And you're thinking, oh, it must have been, you're saying it was really bad in Cuba. But then we look at how you behave and your group operates, and you guys behave fairly badly. So, common sense starts to tell you, there was something wrong with you guys. You couldn't mix what was going on in Cuba. And that's true. They had a different value system. And we could see it played out in the U.S., in Miami. You saw it with the Elian Gonzalez deal. It was almost some bully stuff. The Cubans figured, we ought to be able to have this kid. And the U.S. government kind of manipulated the right-wing Cuban population as well. But they really played this thing out like it's a real thing. And so we had to do our own study. I had to do my own study to figure out what was going on, right? Because, they really lay it on thick there. They really have tried to convince you that, Fidel was a dictator, Cuba is the worst place you can be. And then you hear about the free education, and you hear that nobody's sleeping on the streets in Havana, right? You hear about the medical school, and you begin to start to think for yourself and realize, oh, I see what's going on here, right? There's a clash of values here. Those who want to continue to, it's kind of like Malcolm's quote that he said, ultimately, think there will be a revolution between those who want to continue the system of exploitation and oppression versus those who want to end it. And the folks coming from Cuba were those who wanted to continue the system. No doubt the Cuban Revolution was not perfect, But Fidel, as August said, was the perfect person to lead it, because you hear now, you see on social media posts, people calling Fidel a dictator and talking about, even people should know better on occasion, saying that the society is closed. I hear some black folks saying it was racist. But you got to put everything in perspective. I think I got this from August Nims years ago. You know, you got to judge Cuba based on its own merit. Benjamin Mays, a great educator, once said that you shouldn't judge people from by the heights that they rise to. He said you should judge them from the depths in which they come, right? Because that gives you a better idea of just how far they go. And Cuba has to be judged from the perspective of, it's not a developed country necessarily, it's a third world country. Can you think of any other third world country that has accomplished what Cuba has? No. Right? Does any other third world country have the perspective that Cuba has when it comes to its international? Of course not. So anyway, back to the whole Miami experience. One of the things that stuck out to me as I was doing work in anti-apartheid work, and so when Nelson Mandela toured the country, it was a big deal. It was a big deal to a lot of folks all over the country, especially people in the African American community who had dived in and done, their share of anti-apartheid work, right? So when Nelson Mandela came to this country, for those who can remember that, he toured the country. Remember that in all the big cities that he went, folks came out in large numbers, especially the African American community. Well, when Nelson Mandela visited Miami, he was snubbed. I don't know how many people knew that, but the mayor, in every city, the mayor had given Nelson the key to the city. In Miami, they refused to give him the key to the city. In fact, the mayor would not shake his hand. Yes, yeah. But borrowing from the spirit of Fidel, the people of Miami, the African American community in Miami, made them pay. And when you Google, it's hard to find this, but this actually happened. I don't know if you all remember this boycott. You remember the boycott? Yes. The African American community said, "Oh, to hell with you guys." And there was a major boycott. That failure to shake Nelson Mandela's hand cost the city of Miami upwards of $1 billion. Yeah, it cost the tourism industry a lot of money. Killed the reputation for a bit because the unions got behind it, and black communities all over the country refused to go down to Miami. This happened in 91, I think. When did you?
Yeah,
90. So 91, 92, pretty much there was a boycott of the conventions and that kind of thing in Miami Beach because of the snub that the city of Miami's administration had showed them. Because Mandela was talking about Fidel. I'll never forget, as long as I live, when he was interviewed on Nightline. And Ted Koppel did everything he could to make Nelson Mandela denounce Fidel Castro. I'll never forget as long as I live. And he goes, and every time, he would try to lead him in. But Fidel, he says, Fidel is our hero. And I think Koppel almost fell out of his chair. I never seen Koppel lose it. He didn't know what to do. Because he was so resolute. Mandela was so resolute in defending Fidel because Fidel had defended them. He had stood up for the revolution. And the battle, brother mentioned it earlier, but the Cuba Committee, their intervention in Angola, pretty much saved South Africa. Had the South Africans been able to run through Angola, it would be a different story we're telling right now. That's a fact, and everybody knows it. You can't deny it. Am I close? Okay, all right. Okay, okay. And so that was another thing that made us realize that the Cubans were on the right trip. And give you another little Miami anecdotal thing. So the Miami, the right-wing Miami, who I think the Cubans correctly called Gusanos, because they're interesting people because they complained about, they said that Cuba wasn't open, but yet when we grew up in Miami, there were killings. If you supported Fidel, you supported Cuban Revolution, you taking your life in your hand in the 60s and 70s in Miami. Yes, this history that people buried. These guys are running around murdering people. Mind you, while at the same time talking about they were down for people's civil and human rights, right? Talking about the lack of rights in Cuba, but they wouldn't let you have the right to have your opinion right there, right? And that woke a lot of us up because it would piss us off. You start talking about Fidel, and, we don't want to hear it. Fidel's this thing. Well, hold on, man. We're having a discussion here, right? In the United States, that you said, you're here because our freedom of expression. Can we express ourselves? And that used to be a big fight down there because they would not allow other people to have their perspective. But the other thing that happened, and I'll close with this, was that I worked jobs. In fact, when I went back to Miami, because my mother was there back in 2002, I'll never forget this. I worked a job in a warehouse, and there were two Cuban brothers working with me, and we worked hard in this warehouse. And so the brother said, and I'd heard this before, so the brother said, man, he says, if we were in Cuba, he said, we wouldn't have to work this hard. He said, but it's little money. He goes, we'd be working. He said, but we'd have the stuff we need. He said, no, we're barely making it here. And so they kept telling me, we're going to go back to Cuba. And I thought they were joking, right? So one day, we come to work, and they don't show up. And I got really tight with this guy. I can't think his name was Manuel. And he left me a letter. Yeah, I wish I'd kept that letter. He left and he explained, brother, he said, man, he said, I wish you well in this land. He said, but it's not meant for me. Because it's he was saying, he said, it was too much hustle and bustle. He says, the people working too hard, it got too little, there was too little respect. I mean, he really nailed U.S. society. He really got it. That the values here were much different than what he was used to. And he said he couldn't put up with it. And he went back. They don't tell you the story. There's a lot of folks that actually go back. A lot of folks would come to the U.S. from Cuba and go back when they realized this is what I thought it was. And the other thing that woke us up too was we realized when we saw that none of the black Cubans, and we figured, black people got a lot of sense. If it was really that bad, they'd be the first people in the boats, right? And so we noticed that there weren't Afro-Cubans coming over from Cuba, right? That's the other thing that began to wake us up. That all the Cubans that came were white, right? And the black people were staying put. That was an aha moment for a lot of us. So yeah, growing up in Miami was very interesting because the right wing really tried to impress upon us this idea of what Cuba was that doesn't exist. And they've succeeded to some extent because Castro's death, which I think is a victory. It's a victory. He beat the devil. Yeah, he did. Dying to sleep peacefully, he beat the devil. But they've succeeded on some level because you still have people just mouthing things that they, I always say to people, well, have you studied Cuba? Did you look at the other side? What do you know about Cuba? And then they don't understand their own society because if you call Fidel a dictator, that means you understand nothing about U.S. society, right? This society is dictatorial. They've said, what did he say? They said he's a killer. This society kills folks. Just the other day, dropped a drone on some folks. I mean, this society is savage. And so to accuse Fidel and Castro and Cuban society of being backwards is the pot calling the kettle black on some level, right? It shows that you don't understand where you live. And I hope we can discuss that a little further.
Yeah, I've got it. Okay. So we're being technological. So our next speaker is Raven. So if you want to, Raven Ziegler, and she has been a participant in protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline, and she's of the Kuo-Wishasha Oyate tribe.
You can use that one. Yeah.
Amidapiapi, Chante Washena Page Uzapi, Yushkio Monchiakapi, Wambleo Kasui Makiapie, Kuichasho Yate Himataha, Bade Ota Edwati. Hello, everybody. It's great to have you all here tonight. My name is Raven Ziegler, but the spirits know me as Wambleo Kasui. I come from the Kuichasho Yate tribe in central South Dakota. I'm Lakota Sioux. And tonight I'm here to speak a little bit about my experience with being an Indigenous person in America and witnessing revolutionary Cuba from an imperialist nation. So as an Indigenous woman or as an Indigenous person, I grew up on a reservation and we were exposed to the evils of capitalism. We were exposed to the evils of imperialism and colonialism. And since I was younger, I always sought a revolution. I didn't know if it would happen here. I wasn't too hopeful it would happen here, but I was like, maybe somewhere. So I dedicated the early parts of my life to studying different revolutions globally. And a lot of them fell short of the gender aspect. Women were rarely included in a lot of revolutions, and a lot of revolutions held misogynistic values, which made it difficult for me to seek solace in these revolutions. But Cuba was different. As I'm sure most of you know, Cuba had Women's Platoon. Cuba led a literacy campaign, and women were integrated into the workforce at an extremely early time. So I was sold on the Cuban Revolution at a very young age. in 2015, I found myself in South Africa for 6 months studying abroad, and my experience in South Africa really reaffirmed what Cuba had, like the power Cuba had, and the impact globally that the revolution had. So obviously for South Africa, my comrades there had their opinions on Cuba strictly because of Guido Carnival in 1988. But obviously mine were different. I mean, I can't say that I had any experience like that, but it was mind-opening to come from a place, an imperialist nation, the leading imperialist nation in the world that constantly condemned the Cuban Revolution. It was difficult to find literature that supported it, so to go immerse myself in a place where Cuba was celebrated, where Fidel's legacy was celebrated, where there was constant reminders of the international solidarity that was lost in the US. That really took me back. So after I came back, I started getting more heavily involved in my activism, and as most of you know, since 2014, Energy Transfer Partners Dakota Access Pipeline started its construction and started the negotiation process, and in late August, I found myself actively engaging in activism within the Dakota Access Pipeline, against the Dakota Access Pipeline, and I had a chance to visit Standing Rock in late September, and there were a lot of things that I saw that resembled the Cuban Revolution, even though I knew it wasn't directly inspired by the Cuban Revolution. Something like healthcare. Healthcare in Cuba is free, and it's not necessarily healthcare, but the health system within Standing Rock, they call it the medics tent, is free. Food was also provided for every protester at Standing Rock. The educational system at Standing Rock, which a lot of people don't know about, there were programs for younger children that were there. They were more culturally and spiritually based, and also language based, so trying to preserve indigenous languages and really focus on decolonial education, something similar to Cuba. So kind of tying it back to South Africa, during the time that I was there, there was a movement called Rhodes Must Fall, which kind of transcended into Fees Must Fall, and they also fought for decolonial education. And so to have these experiences and relate them back to Cuba, every time it's left with the question, like, why hasn't it happened here? What is stopping us here? You know, and I think it's just the nature of America is very imperialistic, and capitalism has driven America apart from each other. So it's extremely difficult to witness such a beautiful thing happening 90 miles away from the US border and have most of the nation be completely unaware of it and to condemn it. And I think, sorry, keep losing my train of thought, but I don't think there is another leader that, like Fidel, that will come. So we are all very lucky to have a leader, well, to have experienced a leader like Fidel, but with his legacy, that will continue on. And I think that's what I found most inspirational, that as Professor Nibs has said repeatedly, the concept of proletariat internationalism will continue, and it will remain not only in Cuba, but throughout the world, and especially within Africa. And I think there's something that all of us can take away from the Cuban Revolution. It's this idea that we don't have to just protect people that look like us, that speak like us, that think like us. We need to protect everybody internationally, and we need to serve international communities. And if we base our advancement and our achievements on the achievements of the most oppressed people internationally, we will have fulfilled what Fidel wanted. And I think that's what I would like to end on, is remembering that Fidel's legacy was based on the idea of proletariat internationalism, and our collective accomplishments and our collective success and survival is dependent on bringing up the most oppressed people in the world. Yeah, thank you.
Great, and our next speaker is Francisco Chavez of the Committee Morena, Minnesota. Did I say that correctly? Great. Thank you.
¿Qué tal? Buenas noches. Una disculpa porque en estos momentos no van a escuchar la lengua de Shakespeare, sino la de Cervantes. Pero bueno.
I apologize because tonight you won't listen the language of Shakespeare, but that of Cervantes.
Antes que nada, un agradecimiento en nombre de los compañeras del Comité de Morena, Minnesota, Movimiento Regeneración Nacional, por esta invitación.
Before anything, I want to give thanks in representation of my comrades of the Morena, the movement for the national reform from Mexico, for this invitation.
Seremos breves. En Morena, aunque son caminos diferentes y momentos históricos diferentes, comulgamos con la Revolución Cubana.
In Morena, we comulgate with the principles of the Cuban Revolution, even though there are different circumstances and different historical times.
Particularmente de la Revolución Cubana y del legado de Fidel, admiramos e inclinamos nuestras banderas de lucha en cuanto al internacionalismo que se vio reflejado particularmente en el África Austral y Latinoamérica.
In particular, what we admire and we rescue of the Cuban Revolution and the thoughts of Fidel Castro is the internationalism, the solidarity with the peoples of West Africa.
Particularmente en la Sudáfrica de Mandela, creemos que no hubiese derrotado el apartheid si no hubiese sido por la increíble ayuda que prestó la Revolución Cubana indirectamente y directamente en países como Namibia y como en Angola.
We are conscious of the great importance that the Cuban Revolution gave for the liberation of the South African peoples from the apartheid. In Namibia to Angola, and the victories in this movement, it's the great legacy of the international solidarity.
Esta noche hemos escuchado varias visiones, aunque en el fondo es la misma, y solamente quisiéramos rendir honores en este momento a algo que sentó las bases de la derrota del apartheid en Sudáfrica, la asistencia cubana en ese hecho histórico de Angola en Quito, Cuenavale.
We have heard different versions of our panelists about the participation of the Cuban troops helping these liberation movements in Africa. But we want to remark especially that one of Cuito Cannavale, which was the turning point for the fall of the apartheid.
Ese fue el nacimiento de la Sudáfrica libre, la Sudáfrica del Mandela que medio mundo conoce, pero en el que a veces, convenencieramente, los medios de comunicación pintan a un Mandela totalmente alejado de las causas sociales y más color rosita que otro.
We know very well that was the turning point for the victory of the movement that Nelson Mandela led in South Africa, and we know that the media never portrayed this true, but quite the opposite.
En Morena, aunque, repito, hemos tomado por cuestiones históricas y por circunstancias diferentes en México un camino diferente al cubano, rescatamos de la Revolución Cubana la atención en educación, la atención en salud, la protección a la cultura y el arte y el internacionalismo.
The Morena Party in Mexico has adopted a different way to get to power, that of Cuba, but we admire and we find inspiration in the Cuban Revolution, especially in their public health system, which is free, the educational system, which is one of the best in the world, and international solidarity.
Pensamos que la educación, que es un factor fundamental para el progreso de las sociedades y la liberación de los pueblos, tiene que ser prioridad de los gobiernos.
In Morena, we believe that the education has to be free and is the right of the people to get educated for the benefits of themselves.
Pero más que palabras, en Morena estamos empezando a predicar con hechos reales. Al momento, parte de la Ciudad de México, un 70%, es controlado políticamente por Morena y es libre acceso a donde tiene el poder político Morena en el ámbito educativo a todos los jóvenes que son rechazados en las diferentes universidades.
Right now in Mexico, Morena has passed from the words to actions in almost 70% of the city. We have our leaders leading this educational program, and all the youth that are rejected in the big universities, those youngsters find a place to study in our schools.
Peleamos por la vía pacífica y electoral para la toma del poder, pero bajo una visión distinta. El poder político para ponerlo al servicio del pueblo.
We fight in Mexico to gain political power in peaceful ways, but with the vision that once we get the political power, this is going to be for the people and to put it for the service of the majority.
No podemos concebir a un México con monopolios, no podemos concebir a un México con oligarcas, no podemos concebir a México con un sistema educativo y de salud privatizado.
We can't thought of Mexico as a heaven for corporations with oligarchy ruling the country. We conceive Mexico as ruled by the people.
Hace poco nos reuníamos con las compañeras del Instituto Cubano de Amistad con los Pueblos aquí en Minnesota y nos decían algo bien importante.
A few weeks ago, we had a meeting with the international Cuban delegates that visit us in the Twin Cities, and they told us very important.
En Cuba, la inversión extranjera, el inversionista extranjero puede llegar, pero nunca, jamás, a invertir en los sectores vitales que significan un riesgo a la seguridad nacional.
They told us that that in Cuba the foreign investment is welcome, but never in those areas that they may put in jeopardy the national security.
Y en México decimos en Morena que la inversión extranjera puede llegar. Pueden llegar las mineras canadienses, pueden llegar las transnacionales, sí, pero bajo el mandato de las reglas de un nuevo gobierno mexicano, patriota y que cuide a su pueblo. Nunca las transnacionales las concebimos en México bajo un marco regulatorio que no sea el de un gobierno patriota.
The same way in Morena, we think that the foreign investments are welcome. They can invest in mines, in other industries, but always we are going to put in safeguard our principles and never that we are going to put in jeopardy our national security and the future of our people.
Los recursos naturales del país, desde sus litorales, desde sus minas, desde su petróleo, tienen que estar al servicio del pueblo mexicano y no de las transnacionales. Y en eso concebimos en mucho, y repito, inclinamos nuestras banderas de lucha ante los logros sociales y políticos de la Revolución Cubana.
We find inspiration in the achievement of the Cuban Revolution, and many of our points in our program for Morena, for Mexico, are in this same path for the liberation of the peoples and for the achievement of dignity and security.
Por último, quisiera decir lo siguiente. Decía la propaganda nazi de Joseph Goebbels que una mentira, a base de ser repetida muchas veces, la gente termina creyéndola como verdad.
To close, I want to just recall some quotes from the propaganda Nazi. This Goebbels used to say that repeat a lie 1,000 times and it's gonna become true.
Eso mismo pasó no solo con Fidel, sino con la Revolución Cubana.
This is what the revolution, the Cuban Revolution, has been bearing for all this half century.
Sus logros fueron ocultados y en el peor de los casos manipulados, y únicamente se habla de la Cuba de los presos políticos y nos
The achievements of the Cuban Revolution have been distorted for half a century, just filtering the real facts and portraying a completely different reality.
no se puede juzgar a Cuba, no se puede juzgar a la Revolución Cubana, no se puede juzgar a Ernesto Guevara, ni a Camilo Cienfuegos, ni a Fidel, si antes no se miran las terribles circunstancias bajo las que triunfó la Revolución Cubana y bajo las que vivió la Revolución Cubana, siempre al asedio, no solamente económico, sino militar.
Yeah, we can't just criticize any of the leaders of the Cuban Revolution without considering their history and the circumstances that they overcome to achieve this victory in 1959. They were in a very difficult situation. They overcome a big enemy.
Por último, si hay preguntas, adelante, las podemos responder. En la parte de atrás está el periódico Regeneración, órgano central informativo de Morena. Bueno, viene en español, es gratuito, como todo órgano informativo tiene que ser. Muchas gracias.
We are gonna be open to questions. We have our newspaper if you want to know more about Morena. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This has been a wonderful panel. I think we've, everybody should clap. The thing about it is that we've had really different perspectives, but everybody has really united around their support of Cuba and particularly about their admiration for Fidel Castro. So it's been I've really enjoyed this panel. So you all have too, but it looks like people have. So, so we're going to have just a little bit of time. We don't have much time left. We have to leave here promptly at 9. So we're going to have an opportunity for people to kind of express their thoughts about Fidel, to their questions, and to the panel, and to August, and to any discussion that people have. I just want to ask people to limit it to 2 minutes because we have so little time left. It is 8:45. We have to leave promptly at 9. So, and John Clement, one of our Cuba Committee members, is going to be the man with the mic. I'll just kind of point out, I'll start here.
I have a loud voice, I don't think I just wanted to say that I think the Cuba Committee should be commended for this meeting tonight. I think it's very important, because I think there's one thing we have to talk about, our responsibility in this country. Most of us, for all the 50 years of the revolution, have heard that the enemies of the revolution say the minute Fidel dies, that's the end of the revolution. There was a wonderful, if people got a chance to read, there was a wonderful woman here who said, Fidel didn't die. What she said, Fidel didn't die, we've just multiplied. And I think that's a fantastic thing. And the other response, which people have covered here tonight, I think that Fidel was the most loved and the most hated that any person that any one of us knew in his life, in our lifetimes. And I think it was Fidel in the revolution, Fidel because of the leadership he built, not just a single individual, but the leadership he built and the internationalism which other people have alluded to. But the one thing I wanted to say is that I think I'm in the Socialist Workers' Party, and in this country, and I think that one of the things we plan to do is continue to publish the books and get the ideas of the Cuban Revolution out, which I think is the responsibility of everyone here. But I think the other thing is that we should be confident as the truth gets out and the truth be known and the conditions continue to worsen in this country, that we will win many, many thousands and more, tens of thousands of working people to the perspective of we need a revolution in this country. And I think the one thing that August ended with, and it's very important because it's a political course that I think can be followed, and that is that there'll be a victorious revolution in this country before there's a counter-revolution in Cuba. And I think this should give us all confidence and go out and advance toward that.
Thank you. Okay, Jill, who's next, right here?
Yeah, this is just really quick. I have a link here, I didn't bring enough flyers, to a really beautiful film on the Latin American School of Medicine in Cuba. And it was put together by students who are still there, and ones who are graduated, and ones who are doctors. And it's a free, a beautiful, inspiring, free film on the internet. And anybody could come up to me and I could tell you the link if you want, or you could just Google, community doctors. Community Doctors Official Documentary 2016 ELAM, and it'll come up. But it's really worth watching. I cry every time I watch it. Beautiful. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments, or back there?
I just wanted, I love the meeting too. I just wanted to say something on the opportunity, so I wanted to introduce someone whose name is Gloria, but not the Gloria mentioned earlier. There are tens of thousands and more of working people across this country who are doing a lot of thinking lately. And I know that because I've met hundreds of them. Like Helen, I'm with the Socialist Workers' Party, and one of the things we've done over the last year in particular is meet people at their homes, go to working class neighborhoods, never met before, knock on the door, and they open it up. Gloria opened up the door and she said, "Come on in. I don't know about communism and socialism, and I'm not sure I'm interested, but you look interesting. Come on in." Me and a comrade from Guatemala, originally an indigenous person. Anyway, we looked interesting and different. She said, "You don't have to tell me about exploitation and oppression." She says, "That's my life. I could tell you lots of stories," when she told some. "But I don't think we can make a difference." And I think that's the challenge before us here. So one of the things in the course of the discussion, we looked at what had just happened in the election. Why do the parties, the political leaders, why do the ruling class fear working people? And talked about that for a bit. And then I asked her, "What do you think about Cuba?" Because she had said, we're talking concretely, what working people could do. She said, "Well, that's something." She says, "I always thought my whole life," and this is a woman, an older woman like myself, maybe even a couple of years on me, who worked all her life but was retired. She said, "I always thought that he was horrible and that they suffered from this, and the moment he died, they'd all be so happy." And she said, and I heard that, I watched that on TV when he died. She says, "But I've been watching now for a whole week." And she says, I have to re-examine everything I thought. Because, she said, they obviously loved him. They're all there in the streets all across the country. I mean, someone said, I think it was August, that the Cuban Revolution was advanced, renewed, pushed forward by the participation of masses of people across. Anyway, that's what Gloria saw. And when Helen mentioned about keeping these books in print and expanding their readership in English, Spanish, French, and Farsi and Arabic, anyway, it's really important what we all do. right now, because there are people thinking, and we can help lead them forward. We can go in the shadow of the Cuban Revolution that way. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right over here. He's gonna bring you the microphone. You can stay right there.
Sit down. There you go.
I won't take long, but I want to make a comment that needs to be done. I'm Don Irish. I'm PhD. Handled student trips to Latin America many times, and go down the south and sometimes up in the north of different categories, and have taught in many of the schools down there in Latin America in different countries. Briefly, I was not a fervent person, but I think we might be aware, many you folks may not be relevant, but the newspapers here, New York Times or local, they will print things that are interesting and often exciting, and you don't hear why those things existed. The young women who were fleeing their country, they were blamed when to go back home. They were the ones who made responsible. Who did the financing of them in this other country, who was, very unlike a democratic society? And we do that quite often in the United States. We blame others for something, but don't tell. We report what the immediate thing is, but don't tell the American people where we are financing these things and filing them. And that, I think, is one of the problems that we need to learn and watch for, because it comes in the New York Times or local papers of some incident, does not adequately indicate, well, if these people are for it, what are we been doing behind the scene in financing these details in taking countries, other countries' head of the power. We help put the presidents and so forth in there, but we control them. And I'll stop with that, but it's
Thank
that
you.
sort of thing that we can't just glibly just say that's their communist or that's this. I was in Cuba several times. I never saw any evidence of communists while I was there, and my colleague, and these propaganda possibilities and so forth, you must know are there in your own country's power.
Thank you. So, it would be great if somebody wanted to talk about Fidel, since we're here for a memorial for Fidel. So,
I don't have much to add to what's already been said. I can just speak to the fact that I just came back from Cuba. Was in Cuba from the 20th to the 30th of November with a number of artists and organizers from across the United States with Witness for Peace. We went to go study art, culture, and the Cuban Revolution. And we're talking with, artists and people on the street about the revolution and the impact of American policies on them. When halfway through our trip, Fidel passed, and everything got quiet. And person after person after person just discussed how it was like a member of their family died. Some people said, your crazy grandpa is sometimes a little off a little bit, and you wonder where he's coming from, but he's your grandpa and you love him. And the Saturday morning, it was more Saturday afternoon, and he passed, I think we found out on a Friday night. We did have one exchange with an artist cooperative in Cienega de Zapata. We drove a couple hours to get there, and the owner came out and she said, I don't know how long I'll be able to stay. She looked like she had been crying all night. So the love that the Cuban people have for Fidel was quite evident. Just from our American eyes while we were there, it was very touching. We got to see part of both the memorial in the square, Revolution Square in Havana, and then the just a little bit of once they got his ashes to Santiago. And again, everything you've heard here tonight, people talking about Fidel and how people really looked up to him. It was quite evident from the Cubans while we were there.
Oh, okay, Joe.
Well, I'm one of the Minnesotans who had the good fortune to meet Fidel in 1993 with the Pastors for Peace Friendship Caravan, which takes humanitarian aid to Cuba in defiance of the U.S. embargo. And it was headquartered in Minneapolis at that time. Among the things we took were some old school buses, and the government seized one at the border, and 13 people, led by Lucius Walker, engaged in a hunger strike. One of the people who was on that hunger strike is Lisa Rotek, who's right here. And so this was a big deal in Cuba. It was a very difficult time there. It was just a few years after the collapse of the Soviet bloc. There was electricity, blackouts all the time, shortages of food and other basic things. This was a big morale boost. And when our group arrived, Fidel was there at the tarmac greeting us as we got off the plane. It's one of the highlights of my life to have, and we had a meeting and reception with him later. And I want to say something about the media coverage that people have mentioned how they accuse Fidel of being a murderer, and that's really angered me. It's really the revolution put a stop to the killings in Cuba of tens of thousands of people by the Batista regime. And as Natalie mentioned, you don't have cops gunning people down the streets there, and you don't have individuals, non-government individuals, shooting large numbers of people either. One of the people on that 1993 trip was a Colombian immigrant, Andres, who was an EMT, an emergency medical technician. He got interested in Cuba. Before he came to the U.S., he was working in the emergency room in Colombia one night, and there was some Cuban emergency room doctors visiting, and they said they came there because they wanted to observe treatment of bullet wounds. They had never treated bullet wounds. And so Andres, that caught his attention, and to think, what kind of country is it where emergency room doctors have not treated bullet wounds?
I just wanted to underline something. Marcy said that the Minnesota-Cuba Committee meets every couple of weeks, and we put on a lot of activities. So if you'd like to learn more about Cuba, I mean, a lot of you are quite knowledgeable already, but please think about visiting our website, signing our email list, and look for news about the upcoming film festival, which will start in February. For 6 Thursday nights at St. Anthony, Maine, we'll be showing Cuban movies with discussions afterwards. So really encourage you to investigate a little more about Cuba, maybe think about going. There are going to be several trips going from that it will include local people. Witness for Peace takes groups, and then the Venceremos Brigade and Pastors for Peace will be going this summer, so a lot of opportunities.
You have to have a passport card.
You have to have a passport, yeah, but, you know.
Okay, so, we have to leave now. It's 9 o'clock, and we want to have a lot of these activities here at Plymouth Church, so we want to be on their good side. So, thank you, everybody, for coming.